So the focus of today is about the recent changes in genetic investigations for people with intellectual disability, and it's going to be a triple act. So we've got Arti Patel, who's a senior genetics associate at Gosh, myself, and Nicole. And my role is really just to set the scene. And also act as the next slide, please, person. So hopefully some of you, all of you have completed the pre-course questionnaire, which is really useful. And then just really want to say that genetics is a young and very rapidly progressing field of science. And in under 200 years, we've moved from Mendel counting his P's to curative gene therapies for sickle cell disease. Today's webinar is going to be focusing on DNA sequencing and its use in clinical practice. As you will know, the DNA sequence is a sequence of base pairs along the DNA molecule. And back in the mid-80s, a bunch of scientists got together in a room and thought, wouldn't it be a great idea, wouldn't it be really powerful if we could sequence one whole human genome? And at the time, that seemed, it's debatable whether that was even possible. But 15 years later and $3 billion later, it was achieved. And this had many implications, but perhaps most importantly, it led to a revolution in DNA sequencing technology. These technological advances have really driven down both the price of whole genome sequencing and the time taken to get the results. And this has resulted in whole genome sequencing transitioning from a research tool into clinical practice. So the NHS Genomic Medicine Service was set up in 2018 to facilitate and progress the use of genomics to improve sort of health outcomes generally. A key element of the Genomic Medicine Service mission has been to integrate whole genome sequencing into standard care pathways in an equitable manner. So just very briefly to talk about that Genomic Medicine Service, the service is divided into 7 regions. We're from the North Thames region, and each region has a genomic hub laboratory, and in our case it's Great Ormond Street. And while it's clear that the Genomic Medicine Service is a highly specialized service, it's important to point out that the service exists both for specialist genetic clinicians, but also mainstream clinicians across basically all specialities. So as you can see, that double helix DNA sequencing is right at the heart of the NHS 10-year plan, and it's considered one of the sort of big gambles to improve the health of the nation. And genomic medicine encompasses many areas, including rare disease diagnosis, cancer diagnosis, pharmacogenomics, and gene therapies. But today we're going to focus on genetic investigation of rare diseases. And I'd like to introduce you, if you're not already aware of it, as a Genomic Test Directory, and this catalogues all the genetic investigations which are available on the NHS, and it sets out what the tests are and what the eligibility criteria for offering the tests are for each test, and which specialities, which clinicians can order a particular test. And as I've alluded to already, there's been a big sort of fundamental change in the tests that are available to psychiatrists to offer for people with intellectual disability to investigate underlying cause. And so at this point, I'll now hand over to Nicole to say a bit more about that.
Thanks very much, Nick. Lovely to see so many familiar faces on the call. So it's great to hear a bit of a background about kind of genomic investigations in general within the NHS, but now really to zoom in particularly on adults with intellectual disability, because this is where some of the guidance and access to genomic investigations has really changed in literally within the last 3 months. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I just wanted to strategically set the scene around why is this important? And I think when we've done surveys of clinicians before, there's a general sense that people do agree that genomic investigations for adults with ID, it is relevant to clinical practice, but we often know that there's sometimes a lack of confidence, a lack of knowledge, maybe a lack of concern that maybe this is something that was taught a long, long time ago at medical school or earlier in training, and this is something that I really need to know about now. So we're here today to really try and upskill you and give you a little bit of information. But if we say things today and actually like, I want to know more about this, or I'd like another session, then please do kind of make note of those things and let us know, because we kind of hope that this will set the scene for a more interactive discussion between us all. But to maybe be a little bit repetitive, but I wanted to set the context around health inequalities, because I'm sure that within the ID cohort, most clinicians would be really mindful of the health inequalities that our patients experience. We're mindful of the change in life expectancy for adults with intellectual disability compared with the average population life expectancy. And you'll be familiar with programs such as LEADER, which are really trying to look at exploring why those differences exist and what we can do to reduce the health inequalities for our adults with intellectual disability. And I suppose I wanted to mention genomics in that context because I think sometimes it's seen as something that's a little bit academic or a bit quirky, but this is a really key pillar or key tool that we can use to really kind of champion the health of the adults that we're looking after and help improve their quality of life. It's really hard to say exactly how many people have a underlying genetic cause for their intellectual disability, and there's plenty of research papers out there, but there's very wide range within that. But from most recent data from the Northwest lab, when referred appropriately and in a considered kind of clinical sample, we're getting around about 40% of all referrals having a genetic diagnosis in this cohort. So that's not always the population of the whole, but when we're really giving kind of clinical consideration to should we have a genomic investigation, then often when we look, we do find. So we're really thinking systemically on a population level about reducing health inequalities and increasing the quality of care that we offer. I suppose the other thing to say is that this is really business as usual in most other medical specialities. If you speak to a neurologist or a rheumatologist or a paediatrician, genomic investigations are very, very standard, and actually within mental health services we're a little bit behind the times. So it is an area that we need to upskill in. Next slide, please. And I'm not just saying that because this is something I care about. I'm saying that because there's evidence to support that a genetic diagnosis is really, really helpful for an individual. In a way, you can sort of view it a little bit like maybe some of the arguments around autism diagnostic testing, say 20, 15 years ago. Well, what's the point? It doesn't change anything. It just gives them another label. But actually, if someone understands the reason why they have the particular challenges that they have, then knowledge is power. That can reduce stigma for the individual, but also their family. It can enable them to join a group, meet other people that have similar challenges. It can support the wider family if they've got siblings, the parents are thinking of having another child, to really kind of help them make informed choices about expanding families or family planning. But most importantly for the individual and their health, increasingly it helps support considering evidence-based management options for kind of more common genetic variants, but also enabling us to screen proactively, which links back into LEADER for associated conditions. So if someone is diagnosed with a condition that we know is associated heart concerns, so that means we can really ask the general practitioner to monitor the blood pressure, or do they need an annual echo? Should we be liaising with cardiology? It enables us to better challenge health inequalities more broadly, which can only be a good thing. And it's not just me that says that. Next slide, please. But I suppose also to flag this slightly out-of-date guidance now from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which again really supports the development of clinical pathways to support genetic testing within all mental health teams, but particularly supports routine testing for adults with intellectual disability. So if I could go to the next slide, please. Now this guidance mentions microarray, so you can scrap that because that's why we're meeting today to consider kind of the current best practice. But we just to flag that as part of routine clinical care, we should be considering within our diagnoses, within our formulations, within our management plans, should we be thinking about genetic investigations. Next slide, please. So why are we meeting today? What are the big changes? So I think there's kind of two main things that I really want you to take away from today. And the first is that the name of the test that you look to request has changed. So for some of you who've maybe been requesting genetic investigations for a little bit longer, you might be familiar with the codes R337 or R29, or you might have requested something called a microarray for intellectual disability. They're not available anymore. They have gone. If you look for them on the test directory, they no longer exist. So now, if you're looking to request a test for to understand the cause of an intellectual disability, you need to look in the category called paediatric disorders. And so I've highlighted there, and the number and code of the test has changed as well. It's R27. Now, I suppose just to flag, you don't need to get too hung up on remembering the names and the numbers, because this beautiful old PDF retro style test directory is also on the way out. We're moving into a web-based directory where you'll be able to put search terms into boxes, and rather than using codes, it should be a lot more user-friendly. So if you put intellectual disability into the new digitized test directory, it will give you the right test. So you don't need to remember this, but for now, I think it's really important to know that the name has changed before the digital directory is published. The other thing to flag is that the type of test that we're requesting has now changed as well. So Nick at the beginning alluded to the rapid kind of evolution of science in this field, and how we've gone from, doing one whole genome sequence to now it being kind of business as usual. So previously we were allowed to request something called a microarray, and to keep it really simple, that's looking at very particular parts of a genome where we know there's commonly associated changes that might be linked with an intellectual disability, and there was a particular consent process and request form for that. Now we're moving to looking to whole genome sequencing, which does what it says on the tin. We're looking at the whole genome now. And the reason for that is because it has an increased yield. So before it was too expensive, it took too long. And the microarray was a better use of resource. But now we're actually able to offer the whole genome sequencing for a reasonable cost and with a reasonably quick turnaround time. In fact, currently in London, I think the wait for the whole genome sequencing is shorter than microarray, or it was recently. So, really it will help patients get results quicker, but when they do get their results, it will enable us to have more chance of finding something which might explain their difficulties. So we're not just doing this to be pedantic, we're doing this because we have a focus on patient care. But the reason we have RT in the room is because requesting a different test has a slightly different requesting process. So we really want to upskill you all to know how that works. Next slide, please. So just to flag, so if we're looking at the paediatric disorders, you'll see a whole different range of reasons why you may wish to request this, the majority of which are predominantly more focused on younger adults or children. But you will see there's the bullet point: unexplained, moderate to severe, profound global developmental delay. So this is the rationale for why we can request this investigation for adults. Now you'll notice it doesn't say mild intellectual disability there, and at this point, I do need to flag that ideally we need to be making referrals for adults with moderate to severe. What I would say is, there's a small caveat to that this is moderate to severe global developmental today in children, whereas by the time someone's reached adult services, we'll have a better sense of how their needs are. So it might well be that someone that's mild in adulthood was moderately or severely developmentally delayed within childhood. So if you have someone with a mild LD that you would like to request a genomic investigation for, it's not an absolute no, but you will need to provide sufficient clinical information to justify why you think they were moderately delayed within childhood, or why they have other associated conditions which would really support us thinking about genomic cause. So really adding as much information as possible to the test form in terms of other neurodevelopmental disorders, presence of epilepsy, presence of dysmorphic features. It may not get approved, I do have to be honest with you, but I think if you clinically think there's that rationale, then typically in discussions that we've had with clinical geneticists, they're happy to have a case-by-case discussion as and when needed, but the official guidance would be moderate, severe and profound. Next slide, please. And then finally, just to flag that, again, we need to make sure that this is a test that's going to have a direct impact on the individual, on their family, or will guide management. So this isn't a test that we're doing just for the sake of it, for curiosity. There has to be a rationale as to why we want this investigation. And for most individuals, as I said earlier, there's a very strong rationale why it might be helpful, but you do need to ensure that you've considered that and discussed that within the consent discussion, because as well as the benefits of the investigation, there are also, factors to consider in terms of when someone finds something out they might not want to know. So, they do need to be able to consider the benefits and the rationale for why they want this investigation. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So finally, just to flag that these investigations are commissioned nationally, so they're available free. There's no direct cost to your service if you fulfil the criteria that I've set out in front of you. So I think often there's a bit of ambiguity or a bit of anxiety from management about, oh, you know, we're going to have to pay for this extra weird thing that you're going to add on. But no, it's funded through the NHS, through the GMS. So please do consider it when appropriate. So we're going to hand over to Artie in a sec, but I suppose I just wanted to set the scene clinically to maybe think about a possible example of someone that you might think about requesting a genomic investigation for. So I'm imagining I'm sitting in my clinic. I've got a newly transitioned young adult that's come to my service. He has a moderate intellectual disability and autism, and there's quite a lot of concerns around him at the moment. Things aren't particularly clear, but Mum's come saying that she's really struggling with sleep, and this has been going on forever, and it's just not getting any better. She hoped he'd grow out of it, but it hasn't. He's also at college, and within college, there are particular concerns around behaviours. He's damaging property. He can get very distressed, and when he does, he often injures himself. And Mum notes that other individuals within the family have similar kind of presentations and concerns, and she wonders, is this something that runs in my family? Could this explain it? So she notes that a cousin has autism and is a younger sibling with developmental delay, which is being investigated as we speak. So Artie, I think at that point, if that's okay, I'll hand over to you to talk about actually what do we need to know as clinicians, how, if we want to think about requesting whole genome sequencing, what do we need to do, and how can Artie and her associates support us with that process?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nicole. So I'm Artie. I'm one of the genetics associates based at Great Ormond Street. So I am employed by the North Thames Genomic Medicine Service, and we're hosted by Gosh. Next slide, please. So the genetics associates are a relatively new team to the Genomic Medicine Service. I've been here about 2 or 3 years now. And basically, we're kind of the link between patients and their families, the clinicians, and the laboratory as well. And we were established to help clinicians like yourselves to meet the demand of genetic testing and whole genome sequencing, and provide some support and guidance around how do people request whole genome sequencing, and what is the process of that. Most GMSs across the country will have a team of genetics associates. At the North Thames currently, we are a team of 3. That is going to shrink very soon, sadly. But depending on where you are, I don't think all of you are based in the North Thames, but we're still happy to help answer some queries and direct you to your nearest genetics associates team if it's not something that we can help with. Thanks, Nick. So the main aim of our role, so what I do day to day is I contact patients who have been referred to my service to discuss whole genome sequencing with patients. So I explain what the test is, what it involves, the different results that they might receive from the test, and I try and answer any questions they might have about the testing itself as well. We're not clinical, so we can't answer any clinical questions for clinicians or patients. But we can help with consenting patients for whole genome sequencing and completing the lovely paperwork that is associated with this process. So I will go on to explain specifically what needs to be completed in order for your whole genome sequencing referral to be successful. Next slide, please. So what we can't do, as I mentioned, we can't give clinical guidance to patients. So oftentimes patients will ask us questions about gene therapy, is it going to cure me and things like that. Whilst we can answer them to some extent, if they do get too clinical, then we refer back to the referring clinician. There is a form called the WGS test order form, which I'll explain later, that requires some clinical information. Unfortunately, we can't complete that, but we can help with completing the demographic info on that form. We are also unable to help with returning results from testing. That is a question that we receive a lot. Unfortunately, it's not something we can help with. We can send clinicians the report, but we can't send the report to patients, and we can't feed back the results to patients either. Next slide, please. So at the moment, there are 2 options for completing your WGS request. So clinicians are able to request whole genome sequencing themselves. They can do the consent and they can complete the paperwork and collect the blood samples for DNA themselves as well, and send that all off to the lab based at Great Ormond Street Hospital. The second and mostly preferred option that clinicians use is that they send a referral to the genetics associates. And most people do that by sending an email to our genetics associates inbox with the referral and a completed test order form. And it just gives some basic info on if there's any access requirements before we contact the patient for consenting. So if they need an interpreter or if they have additional needs that might need a different style of communication, for example. The next step is that the genetics associates would check the paperwork that is sent with the referral. So I've mentioned a test order form, which I'll show you later. And we have to check that the relevant panels have been requested. So like Nicole mentioned earlier, the R27 pediatric disorders panel has been appropriately selected, and there's enough clinical info supporting that referral as well is present on the form. If for whatever reason we have an issue with the form, we will get back to you and just ask you to clarify the information before we do go on to contact the patient or their family for consent. The genetics associates will then contact the patient or their family or carer to arrange a consenting appointment. 90% of the time, these are done virtually via telephone or video call, but we do also offer some face-to-face appointments, depending on where the patient is located. Coming to the consent appointment, we will do our appointment as per usual, so explaining the test and completing the paperwork. And then we will also help to arrange blood samples. So for pediatric disorders, it is preferred to have a trio analysis. So that is where we analyze the child or the patient and both biological parents if possible. We understand it's not always the case, but for genetic analysis, a trio is always best preferred. So in that case, we can always help to arrange blood sample collections or saliva samples for the patient and their biological parents if they are involved in the testing. The genetics associates will then also track the arrival of the blood or saliva samples into the lab here at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And once everything has been received, we can activate the testing with the lab. Next slide, please, Nick. So going back to Nicole's clinic visit. So during that appointment, when you're with your patient and you think that they would be a good candidate for whole genome sequencing, we do prefer that you broach the subject with the patient and their family or carer and just explain that you want to do genetic testing, why you think it might be beneficial. It's a good idea to mention the expected turnaround time for results. So at the moment, results for whole genome sequencing is taking between 9 and 12 months. And that's for routine tests. There is the option in exceptional cases for prioritized testing, but that would require a specific urgent criteria to be met. If possible, it is helpful if you can provide the patient and their families with an information leaflet. All the resources will be shared with you afterwards. And it's helpful if you can just let the patient and the family know that you are referring to the genetics associates and to expect a call from us within the next few weeks of your referral. So I mentioned that when you send your referral to the genetics associates, we do require some information in the referral about the patient and or the family. So as mentioned, you have the option of a singleton, duo or trio. So for example, if one parent is available and another is not, we can proceed with a duo testing if that is possible. It's helpful to know about family circumstances as well if parents are separated. So when we consent for For the test, we prefer to speak to both parents and the patient together. Sometimes parents are separated and don't like to be in the same room or on the same call, so it's helpful to know that beforehand, especially if there's any safeguarding issues such as parental responsibility, or if they're under social services for whatever reason. That's just helpful to know as well. Accessibility issues should also be highlighted, so if they need a translator or if they would prefer a telephone or a video call or a face-to-face one, if that is something that we can arrange. And when sending the referral, clinicians must also send a completed test order form, so that at least has to have the clinical information fully complete. And if you're not sure of the parental details, then we can add that ourselves. So on the test order form, which I'll show you later, we do require the clinical information is added, and that it also includes some HPO / phenotype terms as well to support the clinical scientist during their analysis. The email address to send all referrals for consenting for whole genome sequencing is on the slide and will be shared with you as well after. Next slide, please. So we do have a how-to guide on how to request whole genome sequencing. So again, it discusses both options of whether you want to do the process yourself or if you want to send the referral to the genetics associates. It also has links to all the forms that you will require. So this includes the WGS test order form, which is the TOF, and the ROD is a record of discussion, also known as a consent form. There are also links to our current sample form. So if we are requesting blood samples from your patient and or their parents, there's the link to the blood forms as well. Thanks, Nick. So Nicole has already mentioned how to assess if your patient is eligible for the R27 pediatric disorders panel that you want to request. So that is the first thing you must do when considering your patient's eligibility for whole genome sequencing. Next slide, please, Nick. So this is a lovely test order form. It can be a bit daunting if you're not used to it and it's the first couple of times that you are using it. The genetics associates are very happy to talk you through it and explain what information needs to be included from your end and what information the genomics associates are able to add to the form. So the relevant sections for you to complete have been highlighted in the how-to guide, but again, just highlighting as well. Just check the panel that you are requesting is the most suitable for your patient. If you are not sure, then the clinical genetics team where you are based is always more than happy to answer any queries as well. In terms of clinical information, it is helpful to include information about why you are requesting the test, if there is a family history, and if any prior genetic testing has been complete, whether that has been positive or negative as well. I mentioned HPO terms, and we do require at least one HPO term to be present on this form. So whether that is a moderate or severe profound intellectual disability or developmental delay, that must be present on the form. The more HPO terms, the better. So if they have had a history of seizures in childhood, if they've had feeding difficulties, anything like that, it is helpful to include that on the form. And the main reason for that is because the clinical scientists, when they come to analyze the genomic sequencing data, they will use this information to classify any variants that they identify based on this information as well. Next slide, please. The second lovely form is what we call a record of discussion, also known as the consent form. There are a number of mandatory sections on this form that must be completed, and if they're not completed, then the team at Genomics England do reject our test requests if the forms are not completed to their standard. So on this record of discussion form, I will admit it's not the most user-friendly, and Genomics England are planning to rejig this form to make it more patient and family-friendly. So when we're consenting for whole genome sequencing, we do also discuss a research study called the National Genomics Research Library, and that is completely optional for patients and their families to participate in, and it has no impact on whether the testing proceeds or not, whether or not they choose to participate. So on this form, you'll see a section that says confirmation of your genomic test and research choices. So these tick boxes have to be completed as required. So if you've not discussed the research library, please tick no, and then subsequently for B, you would also tick no. If a carer or a family member has consented on behalf of your patient, you will need to include their details on this form and complete a supplementary consultee declaration form as well, which I can show you later on as well. Next slide, please. So again, there is lots of information on this consent form, and usually a routine practice is that once the patients have signed this form or we've signed it on their behalf, we would send patients and their families a copy of their consent forms, and it just details the points that we have explained during our consent conversation. So this includes the different results that they might receive, including variants of uncertain significance and incidental findings, as well as issues about non-paternity as well. We do get lots of questions about DNA storage, so that is explained during our appointment and also on the form as well. Next slide, please. This form is what is used to collect samples. So if you are unable to arrange samples for your patient, or if you're doing a trio and their parents as well, the genetics associates and yourselves can use this form to arrange for patients to have their samples collected at their local hospital. So for example, at GOSH, we have patients who reside in Huddersfield or somewhere up north sometimes. And it's obviously they would prefer to have their samples collected at their local hospital rather than travel all the way to Great Ormond Street to get their samples collected. So we would complete this form and just select DNA for storage. So we don't require any clinical information on this form, just the basic patient demographic information and DNA for storage. And we would provide this form to the patient and their parents, and they would take that form when they go for their blood test to get their bloods collected for the DNA sample that we require for the testing. Next slide, please, Nick. This is just showing you the updated form, but it is available and will be sent to you afterwards with this slide deck. Thanks, Nick. This is just a more detailed look at the WGS test order form, but hopefully it makes the sections a bit clearer about the information that you need to provide. Whilst there is a list of some HPO terms on this form, there is also a link to the HPO website. So if there is a HPO term that you're not sure of, or a phenotype description that you're not sure what the HPO term would be, you can just go to that website and search for the relevant HPO term before adding it to the form. With HPO terms, you do also have to select whether they are present or absent in your patient. And also, if you are including parents, you do also have to select whether they are present or absent in the parents as well. It is also helpful to know if the parents are affected or unaffected as well, if they are involved in the testing. Next slide, please, Nick. And that's just the WGS test order form has recently been updated. So now there is questions about clinical utility, like Nicole mentioned earlier. So you do need to check one of those tick boxes that's on the left-hand side of the form. Thanks, Nick. So there are a number of resources available to you as clinicians when you're thinking about genetic testing. So the first one that has already been mentioned lots is what we call the test directory. And the main panel that you'll be selecting is whole genome sequencing, the R27 pediatric disorders. If you suspect a particular condition, a single gene condition, and you're not sure if it's included within the R27 pediatric disorders panel, there is also a website called Panel App, and you can just search for your gene on that website, and it will tell you which panel that gene is present in. And if it is in pediatric disorders, then you can go ahead and request that for your patient. If it is in a different panel and you're not one of the specified specialities that can request that test, please do get in touch with either the genetics associates or your local clinical genetics team, and they can advise further. The HPO website that I already mentioned, thanks Nick, is also available just to describe any phenotype terms that you're not sure of. Thank you, Nick. As well as the genetics associates and your local clinical genetics team at the North Thames GMS, we do also hold a genomics question time on the first Thursday of every month. You are very welcome to join and bring any questions. It's not clinical based, so we won't be able to answer any clinical based questions depending on what they are. But please do join if you're not sure about anything on this process. Next slide, please. On the report, there may be, so what happens when you receive the report is the report gets sent to the referring clinician. So sometimes registrars or other clinicians may also receive the report instead of yourself, but you can just ask us for the report if it's not been received within the expected time frame. For some clinicians, they are able to request more than one panel on the app, and sometimes the reports can look like it's only just testing for one panel. But if you go down on the report, it will display in this section that you can see which panels have been tested for. And it will also tell you which version of the panel has been tested in that test as well. So these panels that we look at, especially pediatric disorders, they are updated periodically, and the latest version is always tested for at the time of the test request. But for example, if your patient has had a WGS test 3 or 4 years ago, you might want to see which genes have been covered in that test, and it will just tell you on this report in this section which panel and version was tested. So you can check if you need a reanalysis test done, for example. Next slide, please, Nick. As well as the clinician resources, there are patient resources as well. So as mentioned earlier, it is helpful when you're thinking about doing genetic testing for your patients if you can provide them with information beforehand, before meeting us, that is, about whole genome sequencing. So there are information leaflets, so written information. There is also a video, a lovely animation video, and a normal video on YouTube as well. A common question we get is about insurance, particularly with incidental findings coming up in this test. So more information can be found on this link here as well. Thanks, Nick. So unfortunately, there's just 3 of us for now. We are shrinking, but this is a team, and those are our details. So I'll hand it back to Nicole and Nick, and you can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artie. So if you've got any questions, hold them in mind, because we're going to, I'm just going to do a couple more slides, just wrapping up about some more LD specific resources, and then we'll be opening to the floor to questions. So if we could take the next slide, please, Nick. Oh.
Yeah. I did mention that you do also have the option to consent yourselves as well. So this is just going through the same requirements of what you would need if you were doing the consent yourself. So you can skip through the next couple of slides.
So you'll be sent these slides after the webinar if you'd like to look at them in any more detail.
Yeah.
So just a very quick word on results. I think Artie mentioned the main thing that I was going to say, which is that it can take a little bit of time for results to come back, potentially kind of 6 to 9 months, like even a year previously. So when you're requesting a sample, if you know you're going to be leaving the team soon, if you're a resident doctor, then please do put down someone who's permanent in the team as well, because it really helps just ensure that the results get directly back to the team. You can always contact the lab for them directly, but do think about whose name you put down to request the sample and request the results. You can get them by email. You can also contact the lab directly. If you're requesting a lot of samples, you can get access to the lab portal as well to search for the results directly. In terms of the results that you'll get back, so you will normally get one of, say, 3 outcomes. One would be that you did nothing abnormal identified. For that, you can feed that information back to the patient and their family. If a known genetic change is identified, then again, you can give that information back to the individual. If the individual wants to learn more about that, or if there's kind of ramifications or concerns, then absolutely you can discuss as best you can, but you can also liaise back with the clinical genetics team to potentially explore a genetic counselling referral or a clinical genetics appointment if you feel that that's necessary, or to have a discussion with a genetics clinician. You might also want to think about referring on to another speciality. So, for example, if a syndrome is found that has particular ramifications, say cardiologically or neurologically, then actually it might be about making onward referrals for proactive disease management. And then the other outcome that you may get is a variance of unknown significance, and that's where a change is identified, but it's not always clear to what extent that is clinically relevant or not. And again, you may wish to seek further advice or support about that, but you do not have to make those decisions or give that advice on your own. That is something to do within a wider network of clinicians, including specialist genetic input, as and when needed. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to finish off by just putting on a couple of more resources of help, because I think sometimes it can feel quite overwhelming. So my top tip is really to look at the North Thames GMS website. If you're in North Thames and you're looking to request a test, that is your one-stop shop. It's got educational resources. It talks you through how to request the sample, and really walks you through if you click on the request a test tab at the top. So do take a look at that. If yourself or someone you work with wants to learn more about kind of genomics, then the Genomics Education Programme is a really great resource. It's got different kind of e-modules that you can access, also kind of signposted blogs, podcasts, etc., etc. So yeah, do take a look at that. And if you want information about specific rare diseases, then Unique is a fabulous charity which has a huge number of resources that you can access on lots of different very rare mutations. So do take a look there particularly if you're looking for kind of clinically relevant information to share with the service user or family. It's a really great charity for them to reach out and access direct support from. Next slide, please. I also wanted to give a shout out to the lab at this point here, because I've included their contact details. You were able to email the lab if you have any kind of practical questions. So a lot of the time when we run these sessions, there's questions around, but what if we want to use like a buccal sample, or how long is it going to take to get this back? Or I think Artie mentioned earlier about questioning whether previous tests had been done, or what that panel included, and which genes it was covering, things like that. So if you've got any questions kind of practically around previous tests, or the process of how you request and get a test sample to the lab, then contacting the lab on its generic contact email is a really good place to start. And they will send you previous results. They'll let you know what's been requested before. They can give you kind of guidance around, yes, we would recommend that you consider whole genome sequencing, etc. So they can give you that kind of basic level of advice, which is a useful place to touch base with. Next slide, please. And again, Artie's mentioned genomic question time already, so just to flag that it's a really great space to go to ask kind of generic questions. We also run in parallel a mental health question time, which we're trying to run on a quarterly basis. So we will kind of continue to circulate the link for that, so do keep your eye out for that as well, which is more particularly, it'll be kind of with Nick, myself, and the team to think particularly about requesting genomic investigations and mental health services. So if you'd like to come along, you're always really welcome. That will be on MS Teams as well. Next slide, please. And then just to really flag that there are also some LD specific resources. So that we have some easy read materials that we can circulate, which are really helpful in terms of summarising some of this information in a way that some patients might find really accessible. And then if we go to the next slide, we also have a specially developed video or animation, which is on the North Thames YouTube website. So RT included some links for that already, and then there is kind of the mainstream animation, but there's also one specifically adapted with kind of easy read materials within it, and presented by 2 LD psychiatrists. So you may find that helpful as well. Some of these resources have also been translated, so if you're working in an area where English isn't always the first language, then you can also look to see what translated versions are available. Next slide, please. And I think this is my final slide, just to maybe leave you with a little thought or a challenge around what are you going to do once you've left here today and got back to your busy day job, and maybe just an ask to think genetics, think genomics next time you see someone in clinic. Do you think whole genome sequencing would be indicated, and if so, can you take that step to discuss it with the family and maybe consider making a referral to RT's team? Do try and look at some of the resources we've shared. We'll share the slides, but do click on the links and look at the resources. There is a lot of information out there, and once you've been through this process once or twice, it feels much less overwhelming, and actually feels kind of relatively straightforward. Do also share this with your team if you're able to go back to your team meetings and give an AOB update or something and say, please learn about this, please upskill. We're recording this webinar, so if someone wasn't able to come today, do share the news and ask them if they want to access the link later. And finally, if you want anything more bespoke in terms of another training session, particularly for your team, or if there's areas that you think we haven't covered today that you want to cover, then do email me directly, or you can also, I think, email RT's team if you're looking for some more kind of a repeat of the training that RT's provided today around the practicalities of whole genome sequencing. So I think that's it in terms of presentation. We do have an end of webinar questionnaire. So we'll leave that on the screen for a minute if you're able to take a screenshot of it and go onto the link. I can also post the link for that in the chat for those that don't have phones available. And then maybe in a minute we'll put down the slides and we'll have 10 minutes for any questions.